The topic I'm going to talk about essentially is to answer the question, and maybe what Debbie was alluding to is people in the future are going to say to us, or could say to us, what the hell were they thinking? And essentially when you ask that question, it goes back to the public trust. Now the law is riddled with the public trust, and it's based on a PhD work that I'm working on, but it's let's tackle the trust. Okay, the trust is about the environment, and if one looks at the environment, biodiversity makes a massive component of that. I need to see the screen. Forms a significant part of the environment, and that is to be held in trust. Now, anybody knows what a trust is. I've got a trust for my kids, we've got the Wildlands trust, we've got this trust, that trust. So you've got an entity that is looked after for the beneficiaries. So the public trust, in terms of our legislation, is holding the environment, in particular biodiversity, in custody or in protection for future generations, for current and future generations. It must be protected and so on. And that's what NEMA provides for. It's slap bang in the middle of the principles of decision making. Where does it come from? Very quickly. I think I've got some things in here. From the Constitution, the so-called environmental right. And to answer the one question, this is an absolute right. People have an absolute right to have the environment protected and so on and so on and so on, avoid all these things, degradation and so on, to ensure that the environment is not harmful to people's health and well-being. It's an absolute right, as opposed to right to housing, which is a progressive right. We can't afford to do everyone today, but we'll do these communities and move on. Most important thing about this, and why this is important in terms of the public trust, is about the benefit for current and future generations. And that addresses or allows us or prevents us from making those decisions where future generations say, what the hell? What were they thinking? Where does it come from? Very quickly, I don't want to have a side story here, but it's about things cannot be owned by anyone, but are owned by everyone. And it goes back to the Romans, where nobody could own the air or the sea and so on. They were, everybody had access to them. So if they're can't be owned by anyone, they're owned by all, the collective. The same as the seashore, which eventually gave rise to our Seashore Act, where the sailors dried their sails on the seashore. And if that was owned by private individuals, they couldn't dry the sails, then the sailors couldn't go out, the fishermen couldn't fish, and the markets were fishless, and which was a protein problem. So the Romans had all the answers, and Emperor Justinian put it into law, then eventually came into English law, and they swapped the public with the crown. The king owned everything, but for the benefit of the people. And it came into Western case law. So by putting it into our legislation through the environmental right, South Africa consolidated 1,500 years of common law and a hell of a lot of 2 centuries of case law all into one thing. So we didn't have to go and fight to say who owns what, and this belongs to everyone, this one doesn't, and so on. We just went down to the core and said this biodiversity belongs to current generations and future generations. So there is no fight. Decision making should be in that realm. And if you look at NEMA and you look at the other principles, they all talk to this public trust. Every decision we make has to follow the NEMA principles. And the NEMA principles saying everything that we do must be ecologically sustainable. And there it is. Okay? Development must be socially, environmentally, and ecologically sustainable. All right? And emphasize ecologically sustainable. It's not sustainable as we talk about, or sustained development in this. It has to be ecologically sustainable. What is ecologically sustainable? Well, if you look at this little simple graph, and you go from biodiversity, which is 100% there, no problem, and all the way to there's 0 left. Okay, and that's a gradient. Somewhere along the gradient, there is a use zone of sustainable use. You take one bokkie off, you won't even notice it on your census. Surely that's sustainable. Okay? Then you keep using it and you get to a point where you say, we haven't got very much left of this. If we get a tsunami, we're going to lose everything. Climate change, we're going to lose everything. So there is this area where the extinction is should be buffered. So if you get into that buffer, you are facing extinction. And we've heard over the course of the day and the course of this symposium, how we are finding ourselves in that sort of buffer area going on to the extinction. And of course, when you keep utilizing it, we can push things close into extinction. Now, we've heard about pangolins, we've heard about cycads and so on. And cycads have been spoken about next door. Right, so if we carry on looking at this and saying, where do we fit in? NEMA says very clearly, we've got to fit our decision-making so that the environment and biodiversity stays in this desired zone of use, sustainable use. But why am I telling you this? Hopefully, if I've got time, I'll tell you why. But if we keep going through NEMA, I'm not going to unpack every principle because you guys can go and get the act and have a look at it. But it's really important that scientists know what's there, because this is the decision-making platform that all us bureaucrats start with. So if you keep complaining government is letting you down, I'm busy looking at you, okay, it's partly because they're not doing the principles. Okay, the other part I'll tell you now. But if you look at the principles, you just randomly choose them. It says the exploitation of non-renewable resources. Well, that used to be coal and gold and so on. But now as we get into that area, that buffer area that allows our biodiversity to survive and be protected over a long period, okay, that's we're talking about non-renewable resources. Okay, so any decision we take must take into consequence the depletion of that resource. So if this is the last little piece of this vegetation type with all these endemic species on it, it's a I'm going to choose your word, it's a non-brainer. It's a no-brainer. Okay, I'll just move away from colloquial English to Eastern Cape or Western Cape English, Southern Cape English, whatever. Never mind, that's a different story. But the thing is, if it's threatened, there can be no more use. And that's essentially where we are. If we're getting to the no-brainer, okay, and we're getting towards extinction, we cannot make decisions to further utilize that, because the principles are clear. And we'll see. If we look at other principles, the disturbance of ecosystems and so on, the biology are to be avoided, okay? If they can't, then they need to be minimized and remedied. Not all remedied, and remedied. And what the legislature is saying here, yes, use the system, but make good the trust. If you deplete the trust, you've got to put it back in again. As trustee, the government as the ultimate trustee says, the trust is dynamic, maybe, but if you take something out, you've got to put it back, because we've got a fiduciary duty to look after this entity for current and future generations. And the next principle that those at the back can't see, but it's the same thing. The development, use, exploitation of renewable resources and ecosystems which form part do not exceed the level beyond which their integrity is jeopardized. It's saying that trust is sacrosanct. You cannot damage this trust. And so on. So if one looks at the trust, or those set of principles, it's saying there's damage to this trust entity because of the no-brainer decisions of the past, but government and society now need to move back up that scale into the desired state of use, the sustainable state. And essentially those two principles speak to it, as well as others. Then there's the precautionary principle. Everybody knows about the risk-averse precautionary principle. Well, that's a public trust issue, because it says, if you don't know much about this and the trust is at risk, the answer is no-brainer. Okay? It's a no-brainer to go and do that until you know what you're talking about. Do not deplete the public trust. I'm nearly done. Okay. So the whole thing is, where there's uncertainty where we are, you've got to act with caution along that scale. So that gives you a very broad idea of what the public trust and how it's encompassed at least NEMA. It runs a lot deeper than that, but I just chose a few examples. If we look elsewhere, and I'm choosing Africa because usually it's elsewhere, but Africa are equally pioneering compared to the United States and elsewhere. I took two cases out of Kenya where the public trust was used as the basic argument to stop government depleting the public trust. And they're all development and all dealing with stuffing up biodiversity. And those two judgments were in favor, the only two judgments. Both of them were in favor of the environment, and the judges were very, very decisive in them. In South Africa, we've got a whole plethora of cases. Okay? Most of them is because government has not stuck to the law. They've worked outside of law. But if you go and look at these cases, not one of them talks about the public trust, which irritates the hell out of me because when I do the searches, I don't find them, so I've got to actually read. But if you go and look at all these different court cases, and there are a whole lot more. I wanted to put on more this morning, and I thought, no, let's keep it simple. But they all talk about the public trust being eroded by government decision makers. That something happened, some guy wants to damage the environment, someone says, no, you can't, and it goes to court, and if you unpack it, the judge is saying, no, you've got to look after these things. So we are generating some very good case history to say, listen, the public trust must be maintained for current and future generations. What is the problem? And when I've gone through the problem of decision making, and that's my angst and interest these days, okay, it comes out that government knowingly or misknowingly misinterprets legislation. And one, I could just ask you guys, and you'll put up your hand and say, case in wildlife. No, mineral and energy affairs. Okay, minerals. Okay, misinterprets the legislation. I was in a meeting yesterday that I had to correct their own lawyers to say, no, it doesn't say that, it says this. Okay, because they want to further their mandate. Or government just simply makes a mistake. And we heard about elephants early on. And they just made a mistake. They didn't know about the norms and standards. And I don't think you must punish them for that. Okay, right? Or they just negligently ignore the rule of law. Or they just say, I stuffed that. That's not politically correct, that law. That was pre-94. We don't deal with that. Okay? And they do their own thing. Okay? Or, government's very good. Takes on imagined powers. We're the authority. We'll do whatever we want. Okay? Or just simply operates outside of the rule of law. Just to, so on. And I think I've lost a word there. But anyway. Anyway. What is happening, and if you look at court cases, and unfortunately not very much environmental law, but if you look at the other sectors, school books, how many court cases there were to get school books from here to there. In health, how many times we land up in court on health where people's rights have been eroded or damaged because of bad decision making. 1 minute, cool, okay. There's lots of them. And the problem is we're not, as society, taking on government, environmental government, to say, you are making the wrong decisions and we're going to sort you out in court. We're not there yet. I wish we were, it'd make my life easier. But we need to become more proactive. Okay? But in summary, the public trust wants to do is take people up this thing, and then people in the individual capacities want to use the environment and make selfish, and I say selfish because we all want to maximize our returns and get bigger bank balances, want to push us down at the expense of the environment. And without the public trust being properly implemented, we are going to shift down that gradient which we've been seeing and hearing about over the last couple of days. Okay, let's just do a conclusion because I promised I'll be within time, which will be a first. Okay. The Public Trust Doctrine is probably one of the the least known, okay, and least used principles in South African law. Okay, that is very, very clear. It's been dabbled around, but no one's actually said that's what it is. The important thing is that it obligates people like myself, the decision makers, government, to exercise due care. As a result, I'm getting a nod there, so I must be saying the right things. Okay, it is one of the most, if we look elsewhere in Africa, in Asia, and in particularly United States, it is a powerful mechanism to prevent decisions or decisions of ignorance or decisions of convenience. Oh no, we'll go for the developer because they got bucks, they'll take us to court. But KZN Wildlife, they'll never take us on in court. You know, so we'll make the easier decision. Okay. Or decisions of what I call parochial, social, political, or economic gains. And we're all under political pressure because this must happen because it favors a certain political party over that being the right decision. And we've seen time and time again decisions made of these parochial mandates. Right? But most importantly, when we get into NEMA itself and elsewhere, it is the most powerful mechanism for the public to engage and bring government and government decision making to book. And we still need to explore that. We're still very naive and we've got a long way to go. But it's there. People say the laws are failing us. They're not. They're there. They're just not being exercised properly. Boom. Finished. How's that?